Welcome to My Boulevard podcast, where we talk about everyday issues from a biblical and balanced perspective. I'm Dhati Lewis, and this season we're diving into fighting for the faith in today's culture, navigating deconstruction and reconstruction, and featuring the voices of poets, pastors, practitioners, and polymaths. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy today's episode.
What's up? Welcome to another episode of This Is My Boulevard podcast. I am here with two of my favorite people. One is my favorite person, Angie. Hello.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Good. And Dr. Sandra Thomas.
Hello.
So not only are they two of my favorite people, but they're also are professionals in the field. Angie is a licensed counselor, and Sandra, Dr. Thomas, is a psychiatrist practicing here in Atlanta, both here practicing in Atlanta. And I'm just really excited about kind of today's topic because we're going to be talking about suffering. We're going to talk about mental illness. We're going to talk about just kind of the biology, all of that takes place because, you know, I don't know. I mean, it feels like everything is on the rise when it comes to mental health, right? I mean, I know athletes are being a lot more expressive, you know, in that. We see that in the Olympics. We've seen that over the past Olympics. We're seeing just different people have sharing it. It's like, if nothing else, in the past, probably no one would have known anything, but now it is being more. But that's not often the case, specifically in urban environments. You know, in the urban environments, it seems like we're, you know, this is a different. There still seems like a stigma, you know. And then I know, Dr. Thomas, you've done some kind of research on that. You know, share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's important to have that conversation about mental illness because, especially in the urban setting, there are high rates of anxiety and depression. And if you think about an urban environment, you think about what contributes to that, what predisposes people in an urban environment to mental illness. You think about overcrowding, you think about stressors with work, pollution, noise. And then you think about access to resources. So sometimes cities grow too quickly and they don't have the infrastructure in place to help people. So one, there's a lot of stigma, so people don't get help for their mental illness when they need to. And then two, they might not have access to resources like whether it's psychiatrists or therapists or hospitals as the city is growing. But as the city grows and there's adequate resources, then the city can become a place where there is actually more access to resources. So there are positives that can come out of living in an urban setting. But in general, there is higher risk for anxiety and depression when you are in an urban setting. So as we're in the urban community, I think it's really important for us to know. And just in terms of statistics in general with mental health, I think it's important to have the conversation because 1 in 5 U.S. adults has some kind of mental illness, and over 40,000 people die by suicide each year. So it's really important for us to be talking about these things, especially where we are now.
Yeah, and so when you talk about like, what specific about like urban increases that? I mean, is that just proximity? Is that like you mentioned noises and all that? Well, what do you think
I think in the urban setting, there's more overcrowding, right? Access, there's a higher population. And also think about the people who came into the city. Some of them are coming into the city for jobs. So there was already some pre-existing difficulty that was there before they moved in. So some of that they bring with them. If you think about people now in cities have to live in families, like combined families. So that makes it also, there might be some pressure there, and looking for jobs is harder. So there's financial stress, there's domestic stress, there's the environmental pollution stress, whether it's noise, dealing with traffic. I mean, I hate driving in Atlanta traffic. So traffic is a big stressor for a lot of people. And that's why you also see a lot of road rage. So all of that stress can lead to different kind of mental illnesses, especially depression, anxiety, which are the most common ones.
Yeah.
I think you also have poverty. You talked about that in our time. There's a poverty factor too, where I don't have time. If I'm a single mom taking care of 3 kids, I don't have time to care for my mental health issues. But also poverty and just the stress factors of how am I going to make this work? How am I going to make ends meet? Where's our next meal coming from? You know.
And there's not even enough social support. And we know that the more support you have, the better your outcomes with mental illness. But when you're a single mom with 3 kids, you don't even have time. You have no one to watch your kids when you go to an appointment, for example. So support is a big part of this, lack of support.
Yeah. I mean, like when you're, Angie, working with people that are kind of anxious or dealing with a lot of anxiety, and they're bringing that to a conversation or bringing that to you, I mean, how often, like what often do you do? How do you respond?
Well, I think a lot of times the goal is to normalize or to validate, reflect, normalize. Like, yes, of course you feel that. So I think that's the route, like meeting people where they're at. And I think that's one of the things about urban settings too, is things are normalized, but from the other side, you know, like shootings are normalized. Hearing gunshots anyway are normalized. So
Fire truck, the alarm.
yeah, the ambulance, all of that, the police driving up and down our street 16 times, you know, 2 nights ago, like that's just like, oh, it's the police. So it's for me, dealing with those type of things, especially with teenagers, is one, wanting to normalize it. Like, yeah, of course that makes you feel like, of course you'd be scared, of course, like those type of conversations, to make them feel like, oh, it's okay that I'm a little on edge, you know, here or doing that or whatever. But also on the flip side, not wanting it to be normal, you know, like, no. You are anxious because of this, and that's because that ought not happen. You know, like meeting them where they're at with that. Like, kids shouldn't grow up hearing shootings weekly. That's not normal.
You guys have heard my definition, you know, of trauma specifically, and oftentimes I talk about trauma in the sense of saying trauma is the inability to make sense of something in the past, anticipating something bad happening in the future, right? And that's because you've experienced something. And then whether it's a sin or a smell or you see something or feel or experience something, you immediately go back to that event and you go into kind of fight, flight, or freeze. You don't know kind of what's going on. Sandra, I would love for you to kind of share, like, what's going on in your body, right? Like physically, biologically, what's going on in your body when someone is in the midst of trauma?
Yeah, that's a good question. The brain is a very powerful part of who we are. I mean, without our brain, we wouldn't function well. Nothing else would function well. But so when you are, there are some key areas in your brain that are involved with trauma. And, you know, I'll just name them just for context here. But the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, all of these things are involved. And not just, there's so much more happening. But when you talk about the fight, flight, or freeze response, it's mostly the amygdala, which is the fear center. It's a smoke detector for our brain. It's what tells you whether to be afraid of that spider or not, or the snake. And it tells you whether to get out of the way. So it helps you make a decision. But the prefrontal cortex is that logical part of your brain. And so when things are in balance, the logical part of your brain, that prefrontal cortex, which is the watchtower, we can say, it helps you decide whether it's an actual threat or not. But when someone is in a trauma, that is an actual threat and it's happened at a young age or happens multiple times, that amygdala, that fear center, becomes greater. It actually, the size also increases, and it is activated more often than the prefrontal cortex. So someone who's experienced a trauma, it can lead to fight, flight, or freeze response multiple times over and over, whether it's a threat or not a threat. They don't know how to separate the two anymore because the amygdala takes over. And when the amygdala takes over, there's other hormones that are released, stress hormones like cortisol, and that affects other parts of your body. So it's not just your brain that's affected in trauma. Like you said, a memory can be imprinted that involves a scent, but other parts of when you experience trauma, it can have lasting effects on your body, on your heart, with high blood pressure, for example, on muscle tension, on different parts of your body. So trauma has not just a response in your brain, but an actual complete physical response throughout the rest of your body.
That's really good because you know because like a lot of times I try to explain this, like I break it down as like there's a childlike brain and there's the parental brain. The childlike brain is where that's what you're saying is the amygdala.
Amygdala.
That's why I say childlike brain.
Yes.
It's so that it just kind of talks about it stirs an emotion, and then the parental brain tries to make sense of it, and so that's really good. So like, you know, Angie's like, wow. What are some ways, like when that's going on inside of you, right? Like when it's like, man, there's all type of things and I'm trying to make sense and I'm in fight, flight, or freeze kind of mode right now. Like what are some ways that you can, practical ways to work through some of that trauma?
Yeah, I think there's so, like Sandy said, there's so much going on in your body. And as someone who's talking to someone, you know, like as a leader who's ministering in an urban environment or around people who are having, you know that they're not in their logic brain, you know that they're in this fight, flight, or freeze. You want to help them de-escalate. Like that's where you want to start is, like make them feel safe, make them feel seen, make them feel like they can begin to like calm down, express where they're at. And people deal with that differently. Some people need to get it all out and say it and like, express. And some people need to breathe and, so it just determines, each person is unique. But some of the ways that we've talked about de-escalating is like going for a walk. Nature's really healing. Doing breathing techniques while you're walking or talking to the Lord like he was a friend, as you're walking. But being in nature, fresh air, all those things, it helps lower those hormones that are, those chemicals that have kind of rised up in your body. It can lower those and just being in an environment, like a green space, that's actually, there's things that are also happening that can help de-escalate your body. So I think that's one. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add, as Angie's talking about that, actually, there is something happening in the brain. The brain is what we call neuroplastics. And when you think about plastic, it's moldable, it's shapeable. We used to not know that the brain could grow new connections. So when you're doing things like walking in nature, your cortisol levels are going down, or deep breathing, even when you're deep breathing, that's helping to restore some of the balance between that fight-flight response and just calm your body down. So there's actual biological mechanisms that are involved as you're doing these things like journaling. And when you go to therapy or participate in art therapy or talking therapy, there are actual healthier brain connections that are happening as you're doing those things.
And some of them are really simple. Like I love the senses breathing. It's just simple. You're just sitting there. You're supposed to put both feet on the ground. It doesn't cost you anything. Like you can just do this, and you just sit both feet on the ground so that you remember you're in a place, you're in a safe place, and then you count backwards 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. But 5 is your five things you can see, visualize. 4 things that you can hear, and then 3, 2, 1, and through the 5 senses. You want me to finish? Okay. 3 things that you can touch, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste.
I've never heard of that, so that's helpful for me.
It's called the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique.
Okay.
It's a mindfulness technique. Yeah. Mindfulness meaning bringing yourself back to the present.
Right.
Because when you're feeling really anxious or scared or remembering your trauma, when you pull yourself back to the moment, it can really help your body calm down.
Yeah, because you get stuck in the past. You get stuck in that moment. You heard that sound or that smell or,
Okay.
Yes.
All right, so that was the one that's kind of in your walk.
Oh yeah.
What was the next one?
I think another way is telling your story, like being willing to express your story, either with a friend, with a counselor, even through writing or like artsy expression, those type of things. But I think telling your story is also very therapeutic, and it helps a lot of people be able to determine what it is that they're actually feeling. And for instance, if I was telling Sandy my story, I don't need her to say like, oh, I understand that happened to me too. Like that's not the part of me sharing my story. What I need is space to share my story and to work it out so that I can get back to the logic. Right. And so I can form a connection like, oh, Sandy is a safe place and I can take it there and I'm not going to get judgment. Or she's not gonna be like, hey, you really need to, like not doubt God's presence right now. Like whatever it is.
Right. What are ways that, go ahead.
Oh, and in the process of listening, as a listener, we want to be empathetic, validating, and also ask open-ended questions so the person can tell their story, so you can tell your story.
Yeah. And refrain from the whys.
Okay. When you're listening, don't ask them, so why did you do that? So
right.
Why did you feel it? Why
would you feel that?
Like that just puts you in defense mode, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Comes across as critical.
Yeah, it comes off as critical. So talk to me some other ways that you can express in that kind of retelling your story, Sandy. Like what are some other ways that you can express yourself you can tell to a friend, you can journal. Like, what are some other ways of expression?
Poetry, spoken word, those are ways of expression. We talked about painting, like art, dance. For some people, dancing is a way of expression, can be therapeutic. Exercise in general can be really exercise releases those good hormones, the adrenaline, the endorphins, and that can make you feel good. And so exercise in general can be really helpful for your mental health. And also as part of that, the holistic approach, when you think about the body as a whole, also what you're feeding your body is an important part of overall mental health. What food specifically you put into your body.
That's good. So we talk about walking.
Yeah.
So we're retelling our story. What else?
We've talked a lot about. Go ahead.
Oh, you were going to say worship.
I was going to say worship. Yeah, I think as a believer, that's worship for me is like, especially worship in the setting of like being around, maybe at church or around other people. I think it's an opportunity to borrow someone else's faith, their declarations, right? What they've gone through something and they're writing these words probably. And a lot of times like the declarations that other people are saying become an opportunity for me to evaluate what that is and kind of co-sign like, yes, Lord, I believe that of you too. And that's a grounding. That's also a grounding technique. Just
And I think you see that, like even in First Peter, when we went through First Peter,
right, yeah.
Peter is an exile. He's not in Jerusalem. He's writing to other exiles, people that are spread out all throughout. And he starts off the letter with, "Blessed be the Lord and Father, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ." And is that word "blessed," like the way we bless it, God, is that like we serve a God who is worthy to be worshipped, and it's kind of like, as one who is experiencing similar trials, similar things as other people, like to see Peter being able to worship is like, you're talking about borrowing your faith. And so like, I may be struggling, but I see Peter who's also struggled.
Yeah, and you know his story.
You know his story, and it's like, man, I can borrow some of his faith in that to encourage me in that way. Yeah.
Imagine a movement where every urban neighborhood has trained, dedicated leaders sharing the gospel and making disciples. Here at Boulevard, we're building a family of urban missionaries made up of poets, pastors, practitioners, and polymaths who are transforming lives where they live, work, and worship. From launching new city hubs to strengthening existing churches and ministries, we're committed to making sound discipleship accessible in every urban context. This year, we're asking for your help to raise $50,000 in the last 50 days to fuel this mission. Your monthly commitment helps us to reach more cities, raise up more leaders, and bring gospel transformation to neighborhoods across America. Together, we can impact our cities one boulevard at a time.
I think also as part of that is expressing your emotions, right? Like whether it feels good to cry sometimes, and as you're worshiping, you cry. And meditating on God's word, keeping that in your heart, remembering those promises as you're going through suffering can be, even praying out or worshiping it, like singing out those promises can be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything, I mean, because I know oftentimes for me, I'll, when I'm going through, or I have sometimes I'll just get in the car or I'll go and I'll listen to worship music, and are you saying that that's kind of a thing? Is there anything about being sung on or sung over in a sense, that does help?
Yeah, I think when you're listening to worship songs, you're being reminded of the God's promises, but also positive affirmations in that, because when you are depressed or suffering, there are a lot of negative thoughts being hit at you. There's a lot of lies that are filled in your mind. But so when you're listening to worship, positive message, that's changing what you're telling yourself. You're reframing your thoughts.
Yeah. And a lot of the songs, like the Through It All song that we played on Sunday, I think that's a fairly popular song, but there's scripture in it, and it's like the wind and the waves know his name. That type of those type of lines are super helpful because that takes me back to Mark 4. You know, like I know that passage and I know that's truth. And then it's a connection being made that I'm not making on my own, but the worship music is reminding me. It's like a opportunity to be reminded.
That's good.
Yeah.
So one of the things that what I've heard, like practical ways to work through kind of anxiety, suffering, trauma, is that you said walk, retell the story, and worship. For those of you who want to actually remember it, I like to change it to walk, witness, and worship. Just,
You're such a pastor.
We can pasteurize it a little bit for everyone and just, give us some takeaways. And so that's one. But one of the things that I also think about in, when it comes to is that trauma remains powerful if it doesn't have a home to take it to. You guys have kind of alluded to that idea. Sandy, talk a little bit about like, if you are someone who is receiving, like if I'm coming to you with my trauma, and as both you guys are professionals who are constantly getting trauma dumped on you, if I can say it that way, or trauma spoken to you, what are ways to both handle that, as people are sharing with you, and then how do you also stay healthy with receiving that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think, there is a concept of, I've said this before, secondary trauma. So as a caregiver, you can experience even PTSD through other people's trauma. So it is important to pay attention as a caregiver. So if you're in ministry, you're listening to a lot of people's stories, you're helping people. So it's important for you to also be poured into. And I think the ways for me that I do that is having, sisters in Christ that I turn to. So it's important to be vulnerable with it doesn't have to be 10 people, just 1 or 2 people you feel safe with. You can share your suffering with. I have a therapist, so you can talk to your therapist. That's a safe space for you where you can go and talk about your suffering so that you don't bring it into the context of your session with a patient. You're able to separate your suffering from that person's suffering. And, there are other people who can be a support system for you. But like I said, the support system for you as a caregiver is really important, and having a safe space to be you. And then my own spiritual practices also help me. My time with the Lord, my quiet times, my worship times, all of that is also significant. And remembering that God is in control ultimately, and He is sovereign, loves all His people.
Mm-hmm. I think that's good. That's really good. I was going to add as I meet with mentors and they're reminding me, which I think is all of us need to be reminded, you're not here to fix somebody. You're not here to take on their situation and then be the problem solver of that. You're here to listen. You're here to help them get back to that logic part of their brain. Yes. And you're there to give them wisdom to help them navigate their relationships and their problems, but you can't start making someone else's problem your problem.
That gets to that a little bit more, because oftentimes, especially as caregivers, as Christians, we feel like it is, whenever someone brings something to me, it is my job to fix you. And that even triggers something within us. And then we end up...
Yeah, you experience your own shame and your... Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that. Like, release that pressure valve for people who are getting... that people, whether just people come to them often or whatever, like the feeling or need to feel like I got to be able to fix it. If I can't fix it, then something must be wrong with me, or, whether it's a mom with their child or a sister with her siblings. Talk, both of y'all, just share a little bit about that.
I think personally, on the receiving end, the best things that have been helpful for me is when people remind me I don't have an answer for you, but I'm here with you. That's honestly all I need. Like, my problem didn't go away. The situation hasn't changed, but I have somebody that knows praying with me, who's going to ask me about it, who's going to make me not feel like I'm weird for, having this anxiety about something or whatever. Right. And then on the giving side, I think that's something that I go into each session, or, talking to our kids and, like people at church, anybody who brings you their woes, right, is just like, okay, Lord, you are their God. Like, how are you showing up in this? In what ways can I see you? In what ways can I point you out here? But my focus is the Lord and His power, and not on like my skill set or something like that.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's good. And I would add to that is that just, constantly remembering that God is the ultimate authority and everything is for his glory and he's in control. But as part of, I would say two things is boundaries and recognizing what's in your control, what's not in your control, right? So when you are caring for someone or trying to help someone, trying to fix is not necessarily what they need. They just need to someone to listen to them. And the other thing is that if you're not able to, if all your goal is to fix, it can really blur the boundaries. And not having boundaries can lead to resentment. So I think as a person who's helping, it's important to have boundaries. And
That's good.
Yeah.
So talk about what are some things for them to avoid?
The
Like
caregiver.
the caregiver, the one who's receiving, and hearing that.
Do not overpromise. I think that's big. That's the resentment that you're talking about. Like, not to overpromise. Like, I'm going to meet with you every week. Don't promise anything that you can't deliver. And I would say, just a practical thing that you and I have done is that when someone's asking for something, like to meet with them regularly or to be their accountability or walk me through this or help me fix this or whatever, a very easy way to say, hold on, or you're like, is just to say like, hey, let me think about that. Let me consider that. I need to talk to my family first and see if I have the capacity for that, because I'm really bad at making those type of promises. And, just kind of putting it off so you have a minute to back up and see whether or not you can actually, get in the bunker, so to speak, or if you need to push them off to somebody else that can walk alongside. So mine would be like not overpromising, because as pastors and leaders, we want to do so much and we're limited.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Angie. And I would just say also, when you're trying to, it's important not to, if you're, I want to phrase this correctly, but it's along the line of codependency or enabling someone. You want to be too wise to that, or just understand if that's playing a role in that relationship, because ultimately you want the person to be able to fix their own situation or help themselves, right? Whether it's through another professional or whatever their situation is.
Yeah, and some of the things that we oftentimes talk about, there's words that are triggering for me now. It's like trying to avoid asking them why questions. Like, why do you feel that way? Why,
Right.
and changing those. You can oftentimes change, and it's a lot more inviting, changing those why questions. Another thing that is trying to avoid is you should go do this. You should go do that. Like, and I think those oftentimes can be shame inducing,
Right.
and everything. And so, and doing that. Sandy, talk a little bit about empathy.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about empathy and as it results to people's shame, because a lot of times that can be shame inducing, right? To people, it's just like sharing and confessing,
Yeah.
right? So talk a little bit about empathy when people are approaching you, and then the other thing that I want to talk about is, how do you know when you need to pass them on to a professional?
That's good.
When you're like, okay, this is out my league.
Yeah. Yeah, those are both good, good topics. Empathy, it is something that can be somewhat learned and can definitely come naturally. But I think empathy also goes along to some extent with compassion. But empathy is being able to say that you're present with someone in their suffering, not that you're completely understanding what they went through, because you might never have gone through the same thing. So Brene Brown, she's a shame researcher. She has a good YouTube video on empathy versus sympathy, but it's basically like there's a hole, and sympathy is where you jump in the hole with the person, but empathy is like you stay on the outside and you say, oh wow, that hole is really deep. I hope you can come out of it. It looks really hard down there. So that's empathy, like saying that, yeah, you have some understanding of how difficult this thing must have been that this person went through. And that you want to be with them in their hardship, in their struggle, in their emotional struggle, and be present with them to hear them.
And how important is it for you to have to be able to navigate your own heart to
Yeah.
be empathetic with others.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's really important because there is such a thing as compassion fatigue, right? That's where, again, it's important as somebody who's working with people who've gone through trauma for me to have my own care. So I am able to put up those boundaries and be able to help someone without blurring the lines there in that situation.
That's good. So Angie, I mean, what would you say is like, how do I know? I'm just a layman, that are some layperson that I'm trying to do empathy. I'm trying to do all things, but this is beyond.
Yeah, I would say in the same way that you learn how to study your Bible, it would be important to learn how to help people. Like do some research, do some classes and those type of things so that you can know the answer to that. I feel like each person's going to be, each person's going to have a
Different capacity.
Yeah, because some people are natural shepherds and they're going to have this more of a natural understanding of what someone needs and to be able to walk with them and not grow fatigued. And then there's other people who they're going to have a limited capacity. I would love to hear what you're going to say, but I would say if it's going to turn into a regular meeting, perhaps it would be time to pass off to like, hey, somebody needs to meet with you that knows what they're doing so that we have a goal and a plan and process. And then I would say trauma also I would want, if I was just a church leader, I would probably want to get professional assistance if it had to do with trauma. But I don't.
Yeah, I think, right, I agree with you. And also when I ask people in terms of when they come to me, there's how much dysfunction and distress is being caused by your symptoms, right, by what you're experiencing. Have you as a, like when you're working with that person, has that been helpful? Has that been leading to some change? And if it's not, and if what you're doing is not helping, then it's time to go in another direction, and you probably need more intensive services, whether that's through more intense therapy or even medications. But my main questions are, how much distress and dysfunction is caused by what you're experiencing? How is it affecting relationships around you, your work situation, your sleep? All of that plays a role.
Yeah. All right. Last thing, Family Feud. I don't know if you guys ever seen the episode Family Feud, but I like to end these sessions off. At the end of Family Feud, they have the speed round, right?
Oh,
So
okay.
in the speed round, they ask us a list of questions. That's when one person
Are
goes
we
out
competing?
the room.
Because Sandy and I love to compete.
No. We're, like, you guys are on the same team.
Don't put us in
But,
games.
That's fine.
But it's with a twist, and so I'm not going to ask any of you to leave, but one person usually goes out the room and all that. And I'm going to ask you 4 questions, but it's a quick response. It's sort of like,
Okay.
imagine like there's 50 seconds on the clock, and then I'm going to ask you 4 questions, and all of the questions are going to come centered around this idea of when it comes to like suffering in the urban environment, right? Or dealing with suffering, like addressing, working through suffering in the urban environment. I'm gonna ask you those. So that's it. And then I'm gonna ask you 4 questions that's tied to that. So one person has to go first. But here's the caveat: the second person that goes cannot repeat
steal
the
the answer.
first answer.
Oh,
Okay.
that's going to be a
I'm
tough
going
one.
first.
So who's
Okay.
going first? Who's going first?
You can go first.
Okay.
I'll try to make something
so
up.
Here it is. We're gonna do this.
That's
So
not
when
repetitive.
it comes to the urban environment, right, and people working through their trauma or suffering or anxiety, right? First question. The clock's gonna start. What's
I
working?
feel so much anxiety. What's
What's
working
working?
as we're dealing with suffering in the urban environment? Oh gosh, I should have gone second. Maybe desire for care,
Okay. What's broken?
resources, and expertise.
What's missing?
2 and that messed me up.
What's missing?
What's missing? Can I change my previous answer? Because I would say resources.
Resources?
Yeah.
All right. What's confusing?
How to solve the problems. Like, what is the goal? It's more like the part that's confusing is the goal. Because we're not going to have no suffering here on earth.
Okay.
So I think that people are confused about what the objective is.
All right. How hard was that?
That was really hard.
That was really hard. All right.
I want to evaluate all of that. It's probably
That's it. All right. So if you remember her answers, you
It
cannot
makes
repeat.
it easier for me
If-
now
if
because I
as
know the
you go-
questions.
but if as she goes, if I hear something that's similar, I'm like, that means you got to
fine. Okay.
rephrase and come up with it.
Okay,
All right.
let's
So
try.
when it comes to people working through their trauma
Yeah.
in the urban environments,
What's
what's working?
Green spaces.
good
All
answer.
right. What's broken?
Social support.
Social support.
Yes.
All right. What's missing?
What's missing? Awareness.
Awareness. All right. What's confusing?
Access to care. Access to resource. Oh, I didn't say that word.
I think that was good. So give me another one.
What's confusing? Where to get help? Is that the same thing?
Access. Where to get help?
Teresa.
I feel like
Oh man, that's,
where
that's,
could you,
that's a
I'll
hard
let
question.
you go with that. Access, where to
okay.
get help, where to go. Okay, we'll give you that. No, was that hard? How was that for you?
Yeah, that last question was
That was,
confusing.
it was confusing. No, I really do appreciate
That was
it.
fun.
If people want to get in touch with you guys, and it's like, man, this has been very helpful. I would love to get more information around that. Where can they find you? Where can they go? Angie, why don't you start?
We can find both of us on the Blueprint website.
Okay.
And you can find more of my information on my www.myboulevard.co.
And I'm at beaconcounselingatl.com. So Beacon Counseling Atlanta.
That's it. Remember, anxiety, trauma, suffering will remain powerful in your life unless you have a home to take it to. And these are two spaces, two homes that you can take it to. And so if you're struggling with having that space to do that, we are here to offer it. So thank you guys for joining us. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having us.